Welcome to the Informal Game. My name's Griff. I've got Chris over there behind the camera, and today we're going to talk a little bit about these things, which I'm sure you know a lot about, but we're going to go into a little discussion on actually using them the way we used to use them back in the old days, so stay tuned. Not that long ago, I was on the internet, and I discovered that a lot of people aren't actually mapping dungeons as they go anymore. I don't know, that seems kind of weird to me. Like, I think that you should be making a map as you go so that you get a feeling of discovery and exploration. And I'm not really sure why players stopped doing that, but a lot of DMs will just hand them a map to the dungeon and say, here you go, where do you want to go on the map? And that's not really the way I'm familiar with playing. So if you wanted to maybe learn how to make maps as you explore, I'll discuss that a little bit. I wanted to go into the history a little bit of the game. The original books, there were 3 of them, this one and these 2. This one had a little example dungeon, and it wasn't really anything you could play, but it just gave you like a little sampling of what a dungeon could look like. And it was limited in how it was printed because of the printing techniques then didn't really allow for it to be very detailed. Not long after probably the first published dungeon that was actually in a book for an RPG came out, and that would have been the Blackmoor supplement, had something that was it was a dungeon, but it was sort of a lot more than a dungeon. I'll hold it up. Actually, you know what might even be better? I'll just show it to you down here. This is the Blackmoor dungeon map. And it's very, it's more of like a complex, like a military complex with other levels below it. But these were the examples that we had. Was the first one that I showed you, which is in the blue book. And then this one, and then later this one came out in the blue book. Which had a really simple map like this. I'll put it down here so you can actually see it. And these were kind of the guides we used for creating our dungeons. There weren't a million different products out there. I guess there were some modules, but the really well thought out and well printed ones were the ones that TSR was putting out, as far as I'm concerned. The way I'm used to doing it is that you're going into a place you've never been before, and it's mysterious and dark, and you don't know what's down there. And as you go, the dungeon master describes everything that you're discovering to the players, and there's one player called the mapper, and their job is just to make a map. So if you were to go down into the dungeon, you might, I don't have graph paper, but I can do a decent facsimile. The dungeon master might say your passage goes about 30 feet of stairs leading down into the darkness, right? And so your mapper would draw like I'm drawing, and then the dungeon master might say, when you get to the bottom of the stairs, you can see that it goes another 20 feet on each side. It's a 10-foot wide passage. Squares in the old game are 10 feet instead of 5 feet like they are now. And then there's like a 10-foot gap, and then it continues off into the darkness, maybe another 20 feet that you can see. And so your players would say, well, we'll move up to where the gaps are and peer around the corner. And the dungeon master might say, oh, but to the south it goes about, let's say, 40 feet. And it seems to open up to either side and just kind of go off into the darkness. And if you look to the north, you see that it goes about, maybe 30 feet. 30 feet. And then there's a gap on your right-hand side, and it continues off. The other side just continues steadily off. So you have about, you can see about 60 feet out, with a gap 30 feet up that looks like maybe a passage leading off to your right hand. In front of you, from the intersection, you might see that it goes about 50 feet. You got 50 feet, and then it ends. And if you peer into the darkness, it's kind of hard to tell because it's so dark, but it seems like there might be like a doorway down there. And so your players will discuss what's going on, and they'll look at the map, show it around, and say, okay, let's go to the door. And they go down to the door, they do all of their stuff, the usual, listening, looking for traps, all of that. And when you open the door, the dungeon master just describes what's there. And so the dungeon master might say, to the right-hand side of the door, you have a wall that goes 20 feet north. North is always the top of the page, just like a map, right? Then it goes about 20 feet at a right angle. It does the same on the other side, 20 feet, and then another 20 feet. And then instead of coming back together, it comes up 20 feet on each side, and there's a little 10-foot deep alcove on the opposite side of your doorway. And so you just draw that, and if you look inside the alcove, you see another doorway. It's very basic how you can map out a simple dungeon. The early dungeons, if you look at something like, I'll show you this one, I'll put it under the camera here for you to look at. Early dungeons like the Xenopus dungeon that's in the blue cover rules here is very easy to map because everything is very up and down. There aren't any super tricky rooms, so it's pretty easy to do a verbal map description for the players to explore. Other dungeons, like if you look at this Tonisborg dungeon, I wanted to just show it off. I'll put it down here. In the Tonisborg book, this is a dungeon from 1973, before D&D was published. And the Tonisborg dungeon is really interesting because it was randomly generated. And so Dave Arneson told Greg Svensson, just explained his technique for generating dungeons, and Greg got graph paper and created this dungeon. It looks different in the originals, but I wanted to show this one. The game was just evolving, and so people hadn't really encountered problems. I think that this is a little difficult. It's got these rooms with weird shapes. Describing those, like that area and that area up there, or this area over here, those are really... I have run this dungeon, and it's really difficult to describe it to the players. Sometimes the players will just be like, here's the map, why don't you just draw it in for us? We can't, this is just taking too long. Ideally, you might want to do sort of a compromise between the really simple dungeon that you saw in the other book and this book, so that you can get really beautiful maps. But the main thing is that when you play the game, your players aren't, they're not going to get to see what's down there till they get to it. And then you describe the shape of the room, and then of course you do all the other stuff that DMs do, where you describe, you visualize the space and describe what the decor is, as it were. I think that getting back to, I'm sure a lot of people watching the show are really familiar with making maps, but there are a lot of gamers who started playing maybe online or with editions that didn't really feature that map making aspect. And I think it's really crucial to reintroduce map making into the exploration, because I find it kind of immersive. I mean, it also creates problems. Like, everything is a problem, and it requires a decision for the players to sit and work together. So it's like we come to a four-way intersection. What do we see there? What do we see there? Which way should we go? And that's sort of something where the players are talking about amongst themselves and strategizing. If you just give them a map, you sort of lose that feel. It's something you kind of develop with your team, so you might have a different style for how you describe what's out there on the maps. But I think you should reintroduce that into your games if you're not already doing it, because it's kind of one of the core aspects of old school wargaming, and I don't know, it just adds a certain look and feel to the game. It's hard to explain until you've tried it in a game yourself. Hopefully this is useful information. Like I said, those old grognards out there will be like, yeah, I already know how to do that. But if you haven't done this, it's worth checking it out, and we'll see you next time on The Informal Game.